This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy, and this discussion about civility and elevating the discourse coming out of the latest Trump rally in Tampa earlier this week, and just the general back and forth between President Trump and the D.C. press corps that's been going on since, basically since Trump announced that he was a candidate for President of the United States. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by Sharyl Attkisson, who's the host of Full Measure. Full Measure is in 43 million households on 162 Sinclair Broadcast Group stations, including ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, all of them. Sunday mornings, also live streams at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Fullmeasure.news is the website. She's also the author of the book, The Smear, How Shady Political Operatives and Fake News Control What You See, What You Think, and How You Vote. Sharyl Attkisson, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start not with Jim Acosta, but how about the other side of this equation a little bit? The recently minted New York Times editorial board member, Sarah Jeong, who in her Twitter account, it's been unearthed, has offered, New York Times editorial board, offered tweets like, it's kind of sick how much joy I get out of being cruel to old white men. Dumas effing white people marking up the internet with their opinions like dogs pissing on fire hydrants.
That's ladylike.
I just can't realize why I can't stand watching Breaking Bad or Battlestar Galactica. The premise of both is just white people being miserable. White people have stopped breeding. You'll all go extinct soon. This was my plan all along. I mean, just like bizarre, juvenile stuff. And she's on the New York Times editorial board now, the gray lady that we're supposed to have so much respect for because we're told so by the New York Times.
Well, maybe even more that so many New York Times articles now bleed news in with opinion. She's on the editorial board, so I understand your objections, but at least that's the editorial board.
Yeah.
There are news articles that regularly state things as if fact that they don't know to be fact, that they certainly didn't witness firsthand, but they're not attributing. That give opinions, the reporter's own opinion mixed in with the story, which, you know, when I went to journalism school, we were taught how to avoid that. So I think maybe even that's a more worrisome trend in a way.
What about Jim Acosta being, she's kind of borderline harassed at the Trump rally and a number of places where he goes? Do you think that they crossed the line? Because when I was, in journalism school, you just reported the facts on both sides of a story, possibly a third side of a story, but you never inserted your opinion. How has Jim Acosta possibly brought this upon himself?
You know, I worked at CNN in 1990 to 93, and when we as anchors were summarizing an appearance by the president or whatnot, I mean, didn't even have to be told this as a young journalist. We simply stuck to the facts. We would summarize by saying, the president just spoke and briefly said X, Y, and Z. The last one I saw, Anderson Cooper, who's not a straight journalist, he's more of an editorial person, he came out and immediately declared it to be one of the most, disgusting performances ever by an American president. Just it's a whole different organization than when I was there. I've never seen Jim Acosta's show or even, I just don't watch CNN, so if a clip crosses my path, I don't know much about him. But I would say in general, we in the news, I think our skin is way too thin. We're criticizing people on a daily basis and in some cases using some very editorial remarks against the subjects of the people we report on. And yet when we get some flack for the sometimes obvious mistakes and bias that we make and that we have, we kind of act like it's the end of the world and that just we can't stand this. And I think we need to have thicker skin.
How would you assess the D.C. press corps' coverage of the Mueller investigation to this point?
I think there's been some good coverage, and I think that there's been a pretty tight lid on a lot of that investigation. There's been some leaks and some incorrect leaks about things. So from that standpoint, there's been a lot of misreporting by tangential reporters who said, for example, that Manafort was going to cut a deal and he was going to give the goods on Trump. Obviously, none of that turned out to be the case. But there's been, some good reporting too. I think that we're just being led to dig sometimes in the wrong direction to the exclusion of other news that may be bigger news. So there are other sides and other facets to this story, such as whatever happened to the unmasking investigation of high-ranking intel and political officials that were doing the unthinkable. People don't understand how rare this is supposed to be and how it's not supposed to happen hardly at all, which is American citizens surveilled by our intel agencies and then their information saved and then their names revealed, but they're supposed to be so-called masked for their own protection when that happens. This was happening at a rate in 2016 that one official alone was unmasking names or requesting it on a near daily basis. That means hundreds of Americans. So I think this is a bigger story we're not getting enough reporting on, and that's the biggest fallout I see from perhaps over coverage of some of these other issues that are receiving plenty of attention. It's as if there's nothing else happening out there.
Well, what is happening with the unmasking? I mean, where does that investigation stand?
Well, from what I can tell, it's stalled. I mean, this was something that members of Congress were very hot on early in the Trump presidency as this became revealed. And to me, it's one of the most important and provable alleged possible crimes because there's a paper trail of who requests unmasking, of what reason they want the names unmasked. And Samantha Power, who's a former high-ranking official, claimed that someone else was making unmasking requests, not her, for a lot of those occasions, which, again, I think would be a crime or a possible crime. And apparently no one's digging into that. I've asked for updates. I've been told it's on the back burner. And I'm not sure why, because I think this goes to something that's been done 10, 20 years perhaps by our intel agencies, spying on Americans improper gathering of political dirt or blackmail material against political officials. These are the kinds of allegations that could be exposed if we dug hard in these other areas, I think.
Yeah, your point about editorial discretion, the stories that news outlets choose to report upon, and then because of sort of the groupthink mentality that exists, it seems to me, you have news organizations become cheerleaders for a particular outcome they want in this topic area they're all covering. Like you did a piece on the Me Too movement in your latest episode of Full Measure, and that seems to me a good example of this. Is like there are legitimate claims of sexual harassment, sexual abuse, sexual assault. Harvey Weinstein's under criminal indictment, and by all appearances should absolutely be. Les Moonves, others, Bill Cosby, et cetera, et cetera. But then there's also this sort of trying to kind of get in on the Me Too action and blurring the lines of distinction between people who really need to be investigated for egregious and in some cases criminal behavior versus the same level of ink and opprobrium directed at somebody who made an off-color joke on the set of some TV show. And instead of providing texture, you're trying to kind of like out pro Me Too, the competitive news outlet.
Yeah, I'm trying to think off narrative as often as possible because even when there are legitimate narratives, there's often more sides and more facets that aren't getting coverage, I find, in today. So today you could call us Me Too in the media because we're all just copying each other on the same couple of stories. And the reason I did that story, you can see a replay at fullmeasure.news right now, is because that was the most talked about thing among my friends, men and women, which is, well, what constitutes, misbehavior. I mean, sometimes, yes, it's unethical or it's bad, but it's not criminal. It's not rape necessarily. And it's all being discussed, in one big lump in some cases. And there are false accusations being levied in this environment against people because someone can be easily destroyed. If you just say, as the subject of my story said, 2 credible accusations is enough to destroy someone. And he said, in today's environment, 1 is. So these things can be weaponized improperly in addition to very real cases of sexual abuse.
Now, when you worked at CBS for years, and I'm sure you've met Les Moonves, did you know anything or hear any rumblings about him with bad behavior toward women?
Not really. I mean, I just think in general there are upper level bosses and things you hear. I mean, he ended up dating, I guess, while married, one of the CBS employees who he later married. There was that kind of stuff going on. He was never. Didn't spend a lot of time around him, and he was not inappropriate toward me. And I didn't hear any specific stories about him. No.
All right. She is Sharyl Attkisson, celebrated award-winning investigative journalist, host of Full Measure. FullMeasure.news is the website. You can also catch it on Sinclair networks around the country. The book, The Smear, How Shady Political Operatives and Fake News Control What You See, What You Think, and How You Vote. Sharyl, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.